folks, if you're joining us for the first time, you are very welcome. This is the weekly Apologetics Academy, which I run every Saturday at 8 p.m. UK time, which corresponds to 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Central, 12 noon Pacific. And every week I bring in a different scholar, speaker, expert, apologist to present to us a topic of interest to Christians, particularly pertaining to apologetics. We bring in Christian and non-Christian guests to present to us about arguments for and against Christianity. We also critique and cross-examine other worldviews, and we're all interested in the pursuit of truth, what is true, what is true about reality, and how do we form a consistent and coherent and correct and cogent worldview. We have this evening Dr. Robert Marks, whom I will introduce in a moment. We have next week, we have Nick Peters, who is the son-in-law of Dr. Michael Licona, who's been on the webinar in the past. Nick Peters is going to be talking to us about the resurrection of Jesus, an honor-shame perspective. So that will be fascinating, talking about some of the case for the resurrection. And then the following week, we have Sir Anthony Buzzard, who is a biblical Unitarian who denies the deity of Christ. And we're going to bring him on to talk to us about why he's a biblical Unitarian, and we're going to ask him questions and evaluate the arguments that he brings to bear on that particular topic. And then the following week, we are going to be talking to, this is September 17th, we're going to be talking to Lynn Wilder, who is an ex-Mormon, and she's going to be talking to us about sharing the gospel with Mormons. And then the week after that, on September 24th, we have Alan Hainline, who is an expert on the cosmic fine-tuning argument, and he's going to be talking to us about cosmic fine-tuning as evidence for the existence of God. So there's a number of ways that you can participate in this evening's discussion. You can simply watch and listen anonymously. You'll notice there's also a chat box. You can participate in the chat window as you like, and that will be going on throughout the session. You can also submit questions anonymously by hitting the Q&A button, and you can type in your question and we will get to those in the Q&A. If you would prefer to interact directly with our speaker this evening, you can raise your hand by hitting the raise hand button, and I will promote you to be a co-panelist with our speaker this evening, and you'll have an opportunity to interact and go back and forth and have a conversation one-on-one with our speaker and get your questions addressed, or you can bring up critiques or comments or whatever you like, questions of clarification, whatever. So as I mentioned, this evening we are blessed to have Dr. Robert Marks, who is a well-known personality in the intelligent design community in particular. He's based at Baylor University, and he's a bit of a polymath, and he is this evening going to be talking to us about the nature of omniscience. I am not quite familiar with the argument that he's going to be presenting, so I'll be learning this probably for the first time as well. So I look forward to hearing what Dr. Marks has to say. Dr. Marks, do you want to maybe just start by introducing yourself and just kick into your presentation?
Yeah, sure. I am first of all delighted to be here. It's always good to be among people who talk about things which are incredibly important, and we're going to be talking about some of those important things today. So thank you for the invitation, and it's wonderful to be here. I am a follower of Christ. I became a Christian when I was a junior in college, and we could have a long talk about that. But basically, I discovered that, like Blaise Pascal said, there was a God-shaped vacuum inside me that could only be filled through the salvation of Christ. So I've been a follower of Christ since then, and I'm really interested in apologetics because I think that when many people come to Christ, they come and they don't know everything. When I talk to people about Christ, I say, sometimes you don't have to understand everything to make the step towards accepting Christ. And that indeed was the case with me. But no other than Stephen Hawking said that we never prove anything in physics. Rather, what we do is we accumulate evidence. And I think that's the same thing for the Christian faith. And that's where apologetics comes in. We're accumulating evidence for our faith. And indeed, if our faith in Christ and his role in terms of our salvation is true, then any of the things that we look at are going to only glorify God more. So that's one of the reasons that I'm interested in apologetics. And now I have developed evidence through apologetics where some of these uncertainties are gone. And I believe without a doubt now that there is a God, that God is the God of the Bible, that Christ was his son, that Christ died for us and died for his sins. So that's my background. I spent professionally 26 years at the University of Washington in Seattle. And there's a great man, one of my heroes, Walter Bradley, who was at Baylor University and invited me to come to Baylor. And when he invited me, he said Baylor was trying to do something that no other university had ever tried to do, which was to try to become a serious research university. And that's where God has gifted me in terms of research in my field, and also celebrate the Lordship of Christ. So like any institution that's Christian, Baylor has its bumps, but it's a place I can still pray with students. I can be very open about my faith, and we can do great and wonderful things here. So I don't think there's any place in the world I'd rather be right now. So that's kind of the background. I've been here since 2003 after the University of Washington, and are really, really enjoying it. So with that, let me share my screen, and let's see. I have a PowerPoint presentation, and I'll probably go with the PowerPoint presentation. Hopefully now you can see some of this. I want to first of all pitch a book that's going to come out maybe in 1 month or 1 or 2 months from now, published by World Scientific. It's called Introduction to Evolutionary Informatics. It's by William Dembski, Winston Ewart, and Jonathan told me that Winston is in the audience tonight. So hopefully we can hear from Winston in a little bit. This is a very interesting book, building on some of the ideas of William Dembski. We have done a number of interesting things. Number one, we have codified the idea of information and search, that the evolutionary search that is done on computers can only be done when it's infused with information from the programmer. And not only have we talked about that, but we have the ability to measure it and measure the amount of information which is infused in terms of bits. One of the programs that we analyzed was Avida. Avida is a popularly used computer program which claims to simulate evolution, and was also instrumental in the Dover trial, where Judge Jones handed down the ruling that intelligent design was a religion. One of the co-authors of Avida, Pinnock, I believe it was, made a testimony that, yes, not only did Avida work, but Avida was not an instantiation or an example of evolution, but it was evolution. And one of the things that we talk about in this book is how we measured the amount of information that the programmers of Avida put into the process, and actually were able to measure it in bits. And some of the other things that are happening in the book are the ability to measure specified complexity. We all know that when we look at Mount Rushmore, we see patterns, or we see design, as opposed to when we look at Mount Fuji. But what's the theory behind that? What's the mathematics behind that? In the book, there's actually a development of an idea called algorithmic specified complexity that can actually look at a designed element and tell the degree to which it is designed and actually measure it in bits. So therefore, we have developed kind of the mathematics behind some of these things. And I always have to downplay the mathematics in here. We wrote the book kind of akin to Michael Behe. When Michael Behe wrote Darwin's Black Box, he put little X's by all of the places where he got into deep, ugly detail about biochemistry. And when I read Darwin's Black Box, I skipped all of those because I don't have that background. We've done the similar thing in Introduction to Evolutionary Informatics. We have actually put little tags by all of the heavy math and written the book at a high level so that those that want to read it can actually read it without deep knowledge of mathematics. That always scares away people, but it really shouldn't. Mathematics is fun. So let me talk about Omniscience. This is kind of a standalone project. This really doesn't relate to evolutionary, well, it does in a way. It relates to algorithmic specified complexity and some of the stuff that we do there. But it actually relates to to actually arguing that the following: assuming consistent reality with no contradictions, there can exist at most one omniscient being, and that by necessity this being must exist outside of time and space. That's a radical concept, but it comes from a very simple assumption, which we'll talk about in a minute. This work was actually done by, let's see, David McCready, who was also the author of the no free lunch theorem. And we did a separate paper, and Winston read it and did some interpretation of it, and we were able to write this paper. This paper actually comes from this paper that you see here. It was published by the American Scientific Affiliation, their journal, because it was clearly theistic and had to do with God. We do run a website. It's evoinfo.org, evoinfo.org, and reprints of our papers are all available there, including this one, which is a fun sort of paper. I think you'll find that it's fun. We'll see. There is an incredible power in apologetics and mathematics and philosophy and so-called meta-analysis. What do we mean by meta-analysis? Meta means self-reference. It means that you are actually taking a statement and you are do a little feedback loop, and you analyze the statement with the statement. For example, meta statements can be true. I can say this sentence has 5 words. Notice there is the reference back to the statement. This sentence has 5 words, and indeed, that's true. This sentence does have 5 words. Very curious way of doing things. It can also be false. For example, I can say this sentence has 20 words, and that's false. But these meta statements have an incredible logical consequence, which we'll deal with. Meta statements can be incomplete. There's a classic example of, by the way, I'm getting some background noise somewhere, kind of shuffling. I don't think it's me. But meta statements can be incomplete. There is the old story about the barber in the small town that shaved everybody who did not shave themselves. And this brings up a paradox. It's a meta statement because when you apply the statement to itself, you ask yourself, well, who shaved the barber? And there's actually 2 responses to that. One is that the statement is incomplete. It doesn't specify who shaved the barber. The other explanation is that the barber was a woman and didn't shave. That isn't used very much, but indeed that is a possibility. So that's a meta statement. When we apply it to itself, we get kind of incompleteness, if you will. There's a statement in Titus that says the Cretans are always liars. Paul said that and referred to a philosopher who also said that the Cretans were always liars. So suppose we have a Cretan, and this is maybe the most beautiful idea or beautiful illustration of a self statement. If that Cretan says everything I say is a lie, well, all of a sudden, if you apply a meta analysis to it, well, if everything he said was a lie, then he just lied. And if he just lied, what he said was the truth. But if it was the truth, it was a lie. But if he lied, it was the truth. So it goes back and forth, and you go through this bipolar sort of thought process where he lies, he doesn't lie, he lies, he doesn't lie. So this is a very interesting consequence of a self-reference, a meta statement, if you will. Meta statements can be curious. I don't know what to say about this meta statement, but if somebody comes up and said this meta statement is true, I don't know if that's profound, if it's stupid, or what it is, but nevertheless, it is a statement because it refers to itself. So meta statements can be curious. Meta-analysis can be amusing, and we see meta sort of statements all the time in cartoons, and when we take the statement of the cartoon and apply it to the situation in the cartoon, it becomes funny. Like we have here, Dr. Fisk's amnesia patients are all offered money-back guarantees. The idea here is that if he has amnesia patients and he doesn't cure the amnesia patients, then they'll forget about the guarantee, and therefore things won't matter anyway. So that's a curious, amusing sort of application of a self-referential statement. This is a fun one. Former skeptic William Butterfield is now skeptical of skepticism. So if you apply the skeptic's idea, they're usually skeptic of Christianity, but they're never, it seems, skeptical of their own skepticism. Here's another one from Shakespeare. There is nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And then if you ask the question, isn't that bad? You say yes, and then you say, I think. So applying the statement to itself actually gives a type of contradiction. This is a fun one. Nothing is written in stone. And the irony, of course, is that nothing is written in stone there. So it's when you apply the meta statement to itself, it's just kind of weird. And then this one, I used to be indecisive, but now I'm not sure. That's also a meta statement. So you can see that meta-analysis is used in cartoons quite a bit. And we find it for some reason to be very, very amusing. I find it very amusing. Meta-thought can help reveal numerous self-refuting philosophies. This is used in Apologetics book. We went through Frank Turek's book, I Don't Have Faith Enough to Be an Atheist, and he talked about the so-called roadrunner technique, where you take an argument of an atheist and you turn it around on itself and actually show that the argument is stupid. And you've seen these sort of things before. One of them I love from C.S. Lewis is that since there is evil, there is no moral God. This is in the debate about morality. Well, if there is no moral God, how do you know what is good and evil? How do you determine exactly what is good and evil? So again, it's a meta-analysis. It's taking the statement and it's applying it to itself. Here's another one. Don't impose your stupid religious beliefs on me. We're getting this more and more in the United States right now. And of course, the irony is that by saying that, the person saying it is imposing their religious beliefs on somebody else. And you get that again from the meta-analysis, from applying this statement to itself. And this is wonderful. This is the idea that there is no right and wrong. There's a story that Ravi Zacharias tells when he was talking with a Hindu philosopher, and they went out to dinner, and there was the argument that there is no absolute truth, there is no right and wrong, everything is relative. And at the end of the dinner, Ravi Zacharias says, and you think you're right, that there is no right and wrong? The guy says, yeah, I'm right and you're wrong. So just the idea of defending this philosophy becomes self-refuting because we're applying meta-analysis. And the self-refuting nature gives you the contradiction. So there is no absolute right and wrong, all is relative. I disagree. Well, you're wrong, and you're right, absolutely. So even those that argue that there is no right and wrong, by applying this meta-analysis, they can be proven to be logically inconsistent, if you will. Let's see. Oh, here's what we get from scientism. Only things proven by science can be believed. This is a philosophy given by some. And of course, when you apply that statement to itself, can you prove this scientifically? No, it's a statement of philosophy. It isn't a statement of science. So therefore, by itself, the statement is self-refuting when you apply this meta-analysis. Now, we can actually get very serious because meta-analysis has very serious applications in the area of mathematics. One is Berry's paradox. If I remember right, this was actually proposed to Bertrand Russell by his barber as a very interesting problem, and I guess the barber's name was Berry. And he said, let's do the following. Let's define a number x, and let's let x be the smallest natural number that requires no more than 20 words to define. Let x be the smallest number that requires no more than 20 words to define. And what would that number be? Well, actually, if you apply that to itself, what you've done, interestingly, is that it's the smallest natural number that, when you say let X be the smallest natural number that requires no more than 20 words to define, that sentence by itself has defined X, use only 15 words. So therefore, we have a paradox here. There does exist no number that requires no more than 20 words to define. Because in that sentence we only use 15 words, and we have already defined the number. The curious part about this, it might seem just kind of a whimsical, humorous paradox, but actually there's a depth of truth in this if you go into something called algorithmic specified complexity. I'm sorry, if you go into algorithmic information theory. If you go into algorithmic information theory, there's something called Kolmogorov complexity, which corresponds to the shortest computer program that gives you an output. And that shortest computer program is unknowable. And it's unknowable because of the same reason that Berry's paradox is weird. So therefore, it does have serious ramifications in the area of algorithmic information theory and so-called Kolmogorov complexity, which I won't get into, just take my word for it right now. Then, here's my favorite. I want you to think about this because I go to sleep with nightmares about this statement. Meta statements can be mind-bending. Here's something called Curie's paradox. Curie said, if this sentence is true, then Germany borders China. If this sentence is true, there's your meta statement because it refers back to the sentence itself. If this sentence is true, then Germany borders China. Now, the question is this a true sentence or is this not a true sentence? Clearly, Germany does not border China. But is the statement itself true? If this sentence is true, then Germany borders China. If you Google Curie's paradox and go to Wikipedia, they will prove that using logic, that indeed this is a true statement. Doesn't seem true to me. Well, it seems kind of almost incomprehensible to me, but nevertheless, people have played around with this. So you notice that this is a meta statement because it refers again back to itself. And it is just I think it's a mind-bending sort of proposition. If this sentence is true, then Germany borders China. The contradiction idea and the meta sort of analysis is applicable in mathematics to any time that you make a proof by contradiction. Those of you that have a background in math know that one way to prove something is to assume something and then go through the proof and show that there's a contradiction. Here's one of my favorite proofs, and this is whimsical. This is not solid mathematics for those of you who are not involved, for those that it isn't obvious about. But here's a theorem, and that theorem says all integers are interesting. Now, can we prove that all integers are interesting? And we will assume now all positive integers. I should have put all positive integers are interesting. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to assume that there is a smallest uninteresting integer. So indeed, if there is a smallest uninteresting integer, if there is an uninteresting integer or a group of them, then there is a smallest uninteresting integer. So that's the assumption. So we're assuming that we do have uninteresting integers. But we can prove that by contradiction. Okay, this is a joke now. Because you come up and you say, wow, assume there is a smallest uninteresting integer, and you say that, that's interesting. So the fact that there's a smallest uninteresting integer is interesting, and so you have a proof by contradiction. So therefore we have proved by this idea of contradiction that all integers are interesting. You probably didn't know that before. Meta-analysis toppled mathematics in the 1930s. There was this grand challenge put out by David Hilbert, which says that we could develop essentially all mathematics by making some basic axiomatic fundamental assumptions. And from those assumptions, we could build all mathematics. And Bertrand Russell and John Whitehead wrote what I have heard called the most important unread book in the history of book writing. It was called Principia Mathematica, where they had taken some assumptions and they had attempted to develop all of mathematics. And they published 2 volumes called Principia Mathematica. And they were attempting to do what David Hilbert said they should do, which was to develop all of mathematics. Until in the 1930s, Kurt Gödel, who was a little nerdy guy from Austria, came up and he proved through meta-analysis that what Whitehead and Russell were doing was simply not possible. And therefore, he took this idea that was being pursued by Whitehead and Russell, and they were and they had to abandon it because he proved that it couldn't be done. And here is an idea. This is from the comic XKCD. If you haven't looked at them, there's some clever stuff. There's some terrible stuff there too. But they have these little stick figures and do these nerdy sort of cartoons. But we have these 2 people on the cartoon on the right, and it say, "Hey, Gödel, we're compiling a comprehensive list of fetishes. What turns you on?" And Gödel's comment was, "Anything not on your list." Now, all of a sudden, how do you include anything not on your list on the list? So again, because of this self-reference, we see immediately that that making this list is futile if Gödel participates. Now, here's the way that Gödel proved his algorithm. This is a great simplification, but he proved that when Whitehead and Bertrand Russell were developing their math, that they would eventually come to what I'm going to call here Theorem X. And Theorem X says that Theorem X cannot be proven. Theorem X says that Theorem X cannot be proven. Now, first of all, notice the self-reference here. And this is, again, what toppled this idea of a universal mathematics from basic foundations. Let's look at the possibilities here. If Theorem X cannot be proven, if this theorem is true, then there are things within the system that can't be proven. So therefore, your theory will be incomplete. There are things which you cannot prove outside of the system that you developed, if this is true. If it's false, then the system you develop is inconsistent. In other words, you're stating something which you can't do. And if this is a false statement, then you're proving something which is false. Therefore, Gödel essentially proved that all systems that you develop either have to be inconsistent, which would be, if this theorem was true, I'm sorry, if the system was false, if the system was false and you could prove the theorem X. So to be inconsistent or incomplete, if you can prove this, if this theorem is true, then there's something outside of the axioms, the fundamental assumptions that you made initially that you do not have the ability to prove. So that was Gödel's idea. As you saw in the previous slide, he got so famous for doing this. He's listed, I think, on everybody's list of the most important mathematicians of the 20th century. And Gödel ended up at the Princeton Institute, and you can see he was good buddies with Einstein, and they wrapped around a long time together. Good people. Now, from this idea of self-reference, there was a book written by Douglas Hofstadter a number of years ago called Gödel, Escher, and Bach. And it was basically addressing these strange sort of phenomena that you get when you have self-reference. Now, we know about Gödel a little bit. Who was Escher? Escher was the guy that drew very strange cartoons. One is on the right here. And you'll notice on the right that we have some people climbing upstairs, and then we have people climbing downstairs. And the people climbing downstairs keeps on going forever. It's a loop which continues forever. You keep going down, but really, what are you doing? You're in a loop. Same thing for the people going upstairs. the people going upstairs. I guess you can see my marker here. So we have the people going upstairs, and it looks like they keep going upstairs, but they're in a loop. So he did these strange sort of things, which Hofstadter called strange loops. And you'll notice we have a strange loop here. And we had a strange loop when we talked about the idea of all cretins are liars. We had a loop there, didn't we? Well, if I lied, I told the truth. But if I told the truth, I just lied. But if I just lied, I told the truth. So it's a loop that goes around. And Hofstadter called these strange loop. Bach is in there because he apparently wrote a piece which sounded like it was continually rising in pitch, but it wasn't. I have an example that I like better, which I'm going to play for you now. It's called the Shepherd tone oral illusion. It's a glissando, and it's a tone which is actually a loop that sounds like it's descending forever. Now, we know we can't have a tone that always goes down because sometimes it's going to hit a frequency that we simply can't hear. But it's not an optical illusion. It's not an optical illusion like Escher has, but rather it is an audio illusion. So let's see if I can get this here. Now, there's actually a YouTube video, which I have here on the, whoops, I went too fast here, which I have here on the left that actually has 10 hours of this ascending tone or this descending tone. So if you'd like to listen to this for 10 hours, on the left there is actually a link to a YouTube video which has this going on for 10 hours. But notice something interesting. Number one is it did have this audio illusion that the tone was always going down. It was always going down as a function of time. But also, as you look at the spectrum, you can actually see that there is a periodicity here. There is a loop. That is, the frequencies as they start from the right and go to the left, that those patterns repeat each other. So this is actually a periodic sort of function. Let's see if I can do that again. Well, clearly this is not Bach, but it is something which shows kind of a strange loop in audio, which what Hofstadter was trying to do by introducing Bach. It is actually a strange loop, which actually gives us a so-called audio illusion as opposed to an optical illusion. Now, here's one of the takeaways that we have from what we've talked about, is that strange loops do not exist in reality. Strange loops do not exist in reality. So therefore, you cannot have a situation where there is a strange loop. If you do, it's simply an illusion or a fun intellectual thing to play with, like the lying cretin. It simply doesn't exist. So strange loops do not exist in reality, whether they be the audio, the pictures, or the humor even. Now, this gets us to omniscience, which is the title of the talk, and I'm going to apply this idea of strange loops to omniscience. And omniscience is kind of like an oracle, the idea of an oracle. Oracles are all-knowing, omniscient in certain areas of knowledge. Now, when we talk about omniscience in terms of God, we mean all-knowing. It's just not omniscient about a little piece of something, but it's omniscient over everything. We'll consider only binary oracles. So if we have something which is omniscient, we should be able to go to that omniscient oracle, ask it anything, and that oracle will be knowledgeable about what happened. And we'll restrict ourselves for simplicity of analysis to just ideas that that are answered yes and no, binary oracles. So therefore, our oracles are something which we can only ask yes and no questions. The idea generalizes to non-binary oracles, but that's what we'll do in this case. Now, we will say that Alice has Bob omniscience. Alice has Bob omniscience if she can answer yes and no questions about Bob. So here's Alice, here's Bob. If Alice is omniscient over Bob, then any question which is asked to Alice about Bob, she should be able to answer if indeed she is Bob omniscient. Now, just to set the ground rules correctly, we can't have subjective questions. We can't have questions like, will Agent 89 be more beautiful than Agent 86 tomorrow? That's a very subjective question in terms of yes and no answers. And we'll have no stupid questions. Will Agent 23 ever weigh more than love? Well, that's stupid because because love doesn't weigh anything. Or is Agent 007 leafy? Well, what does that mean? So in other words, no stupid questions, no subjective questions. The other thing that we must make sure about in this omniscient is that there are no strange loops which are allowed. Now here's an interesting question just about knowing yourself. This was inscribed on the forecourt of the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. The Delphi oracle is the biggest, probably the most well-known oracle. But here's a question to Bob. Can Bob be omniscient about himself? What if we ask Bob the interesting question, will you respond no to this question? It might seem like a whimsical question, but indeed there's some deepness there. Well, will you respond no to this question? If Bob answers no, well, he's got a problem. If he answers yes, he has a problem. So here is a statement which actually is an illustration, one example of where Bob cannot be omniscient over himself. Weird. Now we actually have this in the Bible, we have a similar sort of problem. And I think we can resolve some things from scripture here. In Mark 10:27, the second part of it, you're all familiar with the phrase, with God, all things are possible. Well, let's apply meta-analysis to this simple idea. If all things are possible, then it should be possible for God to create something impossible for him to do. If all things are possible, it should be possible for God to create a situation that is impossible for him to do. So how do we resolve this? Does this discredit the Bible in some way? No, because as you see in the top here, meta statements can require clarifying context. Here is a situation for for this particular case. Restricting his actions to his chosen nature allows God to be logically consistent. So therefore, if God is logically consistent, he cannot be logically inconsistent. He has to be totally consistent. He is immune from the logical quagmire of statements that appear on the surface to be self-refuting. But are we then to conclude these restrictions impose limitations on God? Absolutely, to the extent that God cannot be contrary to his nature. That's something that he cannot do. And requiring this constraint removes the strange loops from God being omniscient over himself. God has self-imposed limitations. Perfection is limited to being perfect. So if God is perfect, then he can't be non-perfect. So with this, now let's go to the second level of this. Let's have two binary oracles. And here are our two binary oracles. One is Alice, one is Bob. And we're going to see if Alice can be omniscient over Bob and Bob can be omniscient over Alice simultaneously. Can they both be omniscient over each other? Well, here's something which suggests they can't. If we ask Bob and Alice simultaneously, as the questions are here, is Bob's next response no? And then Bob is asked, is Alice's next response yes? And the question is, what happens there? Well, it turns out that the assumption of this bilateral sort of omniscience leads to a strange loop. It can't happen. And here are the details. These, by the way, these ideas become very kind of mind-stretching. You have to sit down in a quiet room and think about them for a while. At least I do. But if Alice answers yes, she is saying that Bob will predict that she will say no, which is contradictory to the questions. If Alice answers no, she is saying that Bob will reply yes, thus predicting that Alice will respond yes, but she did not say yes, thus producing another contradiction. So therefore, in this idea of Bob being omniscient over Alice and Alice being omniscient over Bob, we can't have that simultaneously. Now, what can we have? We can have Alice being omniscient over Bob, because the problem is this bilateral, this two-way sort of omniscience. So we can have Alice being omniscient over Bob, and in doing so have absolutely none of these strange loops. Correspondingly, Bob can obviously be omniscient over Alice, but to avoid the strange loops, we can't have both of them. What about if we add Edgar down here at the bottom? Here's a triple set. Now, if you want to reason through this, go to the paper. All of the reasoning is in the paper. But now we're going to ask something similar. Is question to Alice, is Bob's next response yes? Question to Bob, is Edgar's next response yes? And question to Edgar, is Alice's response no? It turns out that this is indeed something which forms a strange loop. So it means that Alice can't be omniscient over Bob, while Bob is omniscient over Edgar, while Edgar is omniscient over Bob. Now, one of the things in engineering that is very interesting here is that there is a feedback loop. Notice that Edgar being omniscient over Alice actually forms a little loop if we follow these omniscience arrows that actually does a loop around the different possibilities. And because of this loop, it turns out to be a strange loop, and we get these contradictions, and therefore this cannot happen. But if we reduce one of these, if we change one of these arrows, say we remove the feedback, we take Edgar being omniscient over Alice and replace it with Alice being omniscient over Edgar, everything is okay. But notice we have totally removed any of the loops. So there are no feedback loops in the sense of engineering or control theory, and there are also no strange logic loops. So this is a possibility. So to avoid strange loops, we're going to get a little technical here, just bear with me. To avoid strange loops, omniscient flow must be, in graph theory, something called a feed-forward graph. In other words, there's no feedback. One way that we learn to do this is we take all of the agents. So here we have Bob and Alice and Edgar, and we're just going to number them from 1 to 9 here. We have 9 agents here. And we are going to require that a number 5 not have an arrow to any lower number. So 5 can only point to 6, 7, 8, and 9. Doing so allows us to have only, it avoids any possibility of feedback. So 1 can connect to anything. 2 can connect to anything but 1. 3 can connect to anything except 1 and 2, etc. And with that, we can fill in the graph. And with that, we have no feedback loops, number 1, but we also have no strange logical loops. So what I just put on the screen here is explaining this numbering of the different nodes. We number the nodes, and we don't let a higher numbered node connect to a lower numbered node. Now, here's the interesting, here's the interesting observation about that. Suppose that we have this omniscience graph, locally omniscient. 2 is omniscient over 3, 2 is omniscient over 7, etc. We can always put in an omniscience node, which we will call 0 up here. 0 is smaller than any of the other nodes. And we can connect this 0 node to all of the other different nodes and still not have a feedback mechanism. So there can exist an omniscient, a person omniscient over everybody and not require a feedback loop and not allow strange loops, recognizing that strange loops are indeed something which doesn't exist. Now, here's an interesting thing. Let's assume that omniscience changes with respect to time. I mean, if we talk about mortality, people die, people are born. And so here we have snapshots of different agents. Here, for example, we have Bob. In the second later in time, we have Bob has died. And then we have a new guy coming up. Let's see, where's the new guy? I think there's a new guy that comes up somewhere. So anyway, the omniscience can actually change with respect to time. So here, 0 is omniscient. If we go over here, we can actually have 6 being omniscient. So 6 all of a sudden goes out and it can actually be omniscient. And the way that this graph is done, there are no feedback loops, there are no strange loops. So the omniscience can change. But one of the things that we haven't talked about is avoidance of strange loops in time, which is the next thing we do. So let's do that. The question? Okay, on the left here, we have young Bob, and then we have old Bob. What about young Bob and old Bob asking themselves questions in time? Question to young Bob, will old Bob's response be no? And question to old Bob, was young Bob's response yes? This is very similar to the sort of questions that we asked previously. Well, believe it or not, this forms a strange loop, and therefore this is non-answerable. Here are the details about why this is a strange loop. And we do have a strange loop now, except this strange loop exists in time. And I won't go over these because they're kind of mind-numbing. And I think if we get into the details of this, it becomes kind of boring. If you're interested in the details, please go to the paper, and you'll be able to sort this out if you're interested in doing so. So therefore, we have to be careful of strange loops in time also. So that means if we have a system in the past and a system in the future, and we have omniscience arrows, just like we did before, that there can be no feedback sort of happening. And I have done here exactly what we did before. We numbered the nodes, and no big node can feed back to a node with a smaller number. So therefore, the node 8 is on the left here, and node 8 in the past is a node over which node 7 is omniscient. Kind of interesting. But even with the flow of time, there can be an omniscience which is placed in the system and require no strange feedbacks and have total logical consistency. So on the left here, we have the mortal system that is flowing with respect to time. Here we can have a omniscience, and this omniscience now points to all of the different nodes. There is no feedback loop, there are no strange loops which occur, and everything is logically consistent. But notice something interesting. The way we have drawn it is this omniscience exists outside of time. This omniscience must look forward, both forward and backward in time, in order to establish its global omniscience. And that's basically the premise of the paper, is that indeed we can have omniscience in space and time, and this omniscience must exist outside of time in order to be totally omniscient over the entire timeline. So here's the takeaways. I'm almost done with the talk. This, by the way, is another picture by Escher, and it's one of these boxes which are physically impossible to build. That's what Escher was really good at doing. So here are the takeaways. Self-refuting statements are powerful tools to demonstrate the invalidity of flawed propositions, and strange loops result from such considerations do not exist. Strange loops do not exist. They're rather a logical sort of fantasy. By avoiding strange loop in questions proposed by one agent about another, we have argued that there can exist at most a single omniscient being, and this being must necessarily exist outside of both time and space. Third, the strange loop model demonstrates logical consistency of biblical claims concerning monotheism and timeless omniscience. We can only have one universally omniscient being. With this, let me give you the things which we did not prove. This exercise neither proves the existence of God nor refutes atheism. Rather, it says if there is one globally, there can be at most one globally omniscient being in time and space. It doesn't say that that being exists. And the other thing, it does also not knock down Hinduism, because it doesn't exclude the possibility of multiple non-omniscient gods. Certainly within this logical framework, these things are possible. So that is that's my talk, and I'll turn it back to Jonathan now for any questions or any discussion that you might want to have concerning this.
Great, thank you, Dr. Marks. You want to unshare your screen so we can see you better?
Oh, okay, okay. Well, I'm not done with the, okay, there we go.
Okay. So if you want to point open, you can.
Let's see. Stop share. Okay, there we go.
Well, folks, this is the interactive portion of the program. If you'd like to submit a question for Dr. Marks, you can submit it via the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand, and I will promote you to be a co-panelist with our speaker this evening, Dr. Marks, and you can interact with him by engaging your webcam and microphone. So let me begin with taking some of our submitted questions. Both Vladimir Susik and I are dying to know, Dr. Marks, your view on the Trinity, because are the three persons of the Trinity not omniscient of one another?
Well, I think that they're actually one and the same. Actually, that probably never bothered me, because I assumed that the omniscient being was indeed the Trinity. And I talked about it as one, and we talked about the Trinity being one. And I guess I always assumed that indeed that was the case.
Right, but are the Father, Son, and Spirit not individual persons who are nonetheless omniscient of one another?
Well, you know, that's a good question. I think we get into an area outside of my specialty, but I did know that Christ said that he talked about things that only the Father knew, and I'm not sure how that folds into this equation. So clearly, Christ, while he was here on earth, was not omniscient in the sense of God. But certainly I would believe that he is now. I don't have the scripture or the theological backing to defend that. But again, in my presentation, I assumed that the omniscient being was the Trinity, the three in one.
Right. So you said that you don't believe that Christ is omniscient on earth. Is that what you said?
Well, I think that Christ clearly said in some places that only the Father knows.
Like in Mark 13:32 and Matthew 24:36.
Yes, and I'm not sure what that means. I don't know if he's hedging the question or whether he's actually saying only the Father knows and I don't know.
Right.
And if the Father knows and I don't know, then all of a sudden the omniscience question needs to be
right. But he is omniscient now. I mean, we know. Certainly, for example, in John 16, the disciples say to Jesus, "No, we know that you know all things and that you came from God." And so they thus suggest that he is in fact omniscient. And even after the resurrection, Peter says to Jesus, "You know all things. You know that I love you," in John chapter 21. And my understanding of Mark 13:32 and Matthew 24:36, as I articulated recently in my debate with Dr. Shapiro Ali on the deity of Christ, I think that the Son was omniscient during his incarnation and ministry on earth, but I would maintain that the most plausible resolution is that he was omniscient in his subconscious knowledge. So he had exhaustive knowledge in his subconscious knowledge, but in his conscious waking knowledge, there were certain truths veiled to him by the Father, as Jesus says in John chapter 15. a servant does not know his master's will, and Jesus self-identifies as the servant of the Father, and so the Father veils to him certain truths in his waking conscious knowledge, even though in his subconscious knowledge he may possess exhaustive knowledge. So that would be my way of understanding that, and I think that makes sense in view of the fact that he seems to know all things in John 16 and indeed in John 21 as well. But it's just an interesting question, because Vladimir from Montenegro also asked, if we change Bob and Alice to the Father and Son, would the persons of the Trinity be omniscient over each other? Which I think is a possible critique.
Okay.
But Brian Marion also asked, what about the hypostatic union and omniscience, which kind of relates to the same issue. So I think we've talked about that. Yeah, Brian Marion also asked, how does omniscience relate to the Trinity, which is, again...
same thing, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I tell you, that's a question that I really haven't considered in depth.
Okay.
So I can't talk intelligently about it.
Sure.
I can talk unintelligently about it if you'd like.
Right. Because I'm sure someone who takes a Unitarian concept of God, such as a Muslim, for example, who takes a view of Tawheed, which is the idea of the absolute oneness of Allah, that Allah is completely indivisible and limited to one person, may label that as a philosophical critique of the Trinitarian framework. On the other side of the scale, a Trinitarian makes a philosophical critique of Unitarianism by pointing out that if love is an essential quality of God, then how can that essential quality be expressed before creation? Because God obviously is not essentially a creator; he's essentially loving. There's possible worlds in which God does not create; no created beings exist, but God, though is greatest conceivable being, and so is essentially loving. So that requires a plurality of divine persons, which is a critique of Unitarianism. Of course, someone might come back and say, "Well, is mercy not an essential quality of God?" But actually, I would argue that mercy is an expression of the essential quality, which is love. Just as wrath is an expression of the essential quality of righteousness or justice. So that would be my. So one can level philosophical critiques either direction of Tawhid, and your presentation seems to me to be something that someone could level as a critique of the Trinity. Someone needs to give some philosophical thought to how one might address that. So it's just interesting.
Well, I guess on a high level, I would just on a very high level, we talk about monotheistic religions, including Christianity, including Judaism, and also Islam. And I think that this would be embraced by anybody that had monotheism. And then the details about the relationship with Christ and the Holy Spirit would be something which needs to be addressed and needs to be worked out from the Christian point of view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I need to give some further thought to this argument in relation to the Trinity. I'll have some thought about that, maybe write a blog post or something on it.
Okay.
Through. Let's see.
But again, I would go back to my original statement when we said that with God all things are possible. That because of the consistency of God, these strange loops could not exist in the Trinity because of their consistency. So all this quagmire, I don't think, is actually applicable to the interaction of the Trinity.
Right, because the doctrine of the Trinity maintains that there's still one divine being. I mean, we affirm the Jewish Shema of Deuteronomy 6:4. Shema Israel, Yahweh Elohim, Yahweh Echad. Hear Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. There is one divine being. Isaiah 43:10-11 as well affirms that there's one divine being. We believe that God is one in being but three in person, so he's one but complex in his unity. So obviously we believe in one divine being who is omniscient. But then we believe each of the divine persons participates fully in the divine essence.
Yes.
So not a third of the divine essence, but 100% of the divine essence, because the divine essence isn't something that's divisible like a pizza. The divine essence is something which is infinite in quality, so it's qualitatively infinite.
Yeah.
Not quantitatively infinite, but qualitatively infinite. So it's not something that's divisible. So even though each of the members of the Trinity could be rightfully said to be a third of the triune Godhead, it's not correct to say that they possess a third of the divine essence or quality.
Yes.
Ribbon asks, Dr. Marks, did you mean to say that zero must be outside of time in order to avoid contradiction? William Lane Craig, who is a philosopher of time, believes that God stepped into time at the moment of creation.
Well, you know, this is a debate that goes on. I would mention that William Lane Craig is at odds with Hugh Ross, who actually believe that God exists outside of time. And so we get into the philosophical discussion. All that I'm saying is that omniscience, in the manner that I defined it, requires a God that existed outside of time. It's very clear that in the creation of the universe, that time and space were both created. Whether you go through a Genesis account or whether you go back to a Big Bang account, the physicists also believe that time and space was created. And indeed, if time and space was created, then therefore the creator has to exist outside of space and time. And so certainly God at one point existed outside of space and time. I actually, come to think of it, that was addressed in here. It was addressed in the paper, and I didn't actually talk about it. I would refer you to the paper because I forgot what I said in terms of the William Lane Craig versus Hugh Ross sort of conflict. So what I'm doing is I'm looking for the paper here. So while I'm looking, maybe if somebody else has a question, this will take me a second.
Okay. And folks, remember, if you want to engage Dr. Marks one-on-one, you can raise your hand and I'll promote you to be a co-panelist with Dr. Marks, and you can engage him that way as well. John asks, how can a being outside of space-time interact with entities, people, physical objects, planets in space-time?
Okay, I'm delighted to answer that just in a second. I want to show you the actual paper here. This is the paper that I put up there. Let's see, Goodell. Okay. Hierarchy. You know what I should do is share my screen and show you what I'm doing. Thank everybody for their patience here. How do I share my screen? There we go. We share the screen. Da, da, da. Okay, now what I'm going to do is go to our website. Am I sharing my screen?
Yes.
Okay, if we go to evoinfo.org, which is the website, this is the website that the Evolutionary Informatics Lab runs. Winston, who is in the audience, is a major participant, as is William Dembski. There is a place where we have publications, and our publications are actually listed topically. One is in Christian apologetics. We do have the monotheism theory in the hierarchy of inference. So I'm clicking on that. This is the paper that I showed you previously. Now I'm going to do a search for Craig and read you what I wrote in the paper concerning the question that was existed. God's universal omniscient character, therefore, is allowed to exist outside of time and space, and we can fill in an eternal, universally omniscient oracle in Figure 9, as shown in Figure 10. The omniscient oracle, by necessity, exists or has existed outside of time and space. Hugh Ross contends that God existed outside of time, and he explains God's view of time is akin to seeing both the beginning, middle, and end of a movie on celluloid film unwound and laid on the floor. William Lane Craig, on the other hand, argues that God existed outside of time and after creation chose to flow with time. Since God's temporal omniscience prior to creation would still be intact after the transition was made, the interpretation of both Ross and Craig are consistent with the model. So the idea is that if God did decide, in accordance to William Lane Craig, to flow with respect to time, there was a time, and we have to do air quotes around time, there was a time that he existed outside of time and space because he created time and space. And certainly his knowledge and his omniscience existed then, and that was something which must be maintained by God as he flowed with time. He still had all of that knowledge. So that was the response that was specifically addressed here. I don't know if that answers the previous question well enough. But what was the other question that we had?
John asks, how can a being outside of space-time interact with entities, people, physical objects, planets in space-time?
Well, that's an interesting question. It goes back when I came to Christ as a junior in college. One of the books that really blew my mind and actually let me believe that there could exist a God, because I used to look around and I said, well, where is God, the entity? That was a book by Flatland by Abbott, and Abbott talks about an infinitely flat two-dimensional plane, and on that plane there was a number of creatures that existed, and these creatures only were knowledgeable about the two dimensions that existed, and they would walk around, they would do things. And then this one scientist had this theory called up, and his idea was that there was a third dimension, but he tried to explain it to people, and he said there is an up. And everybody asked him, well, if there's an up, then where is that third dimension? And the guy's universe was in two dimensions. What he could do, he could only point north. And I wonder, by him pointing north to kind of explain what up was, is kind of us pointing upwards to say where God is, that we're kind of pointing north in a three-dimensional sort of space. I wonder. But then he had a wonderful visitation by a three-dimensional being, and this three-dimensional being said, hey, look, I've been watching you. I exist in three dimensions. I'm a sphere, and what you say is exactly true. There is a third dimension, and I'm going to show you the third dimension. So he picked up this two-dimensional being, and the two-dimensional being's mind was totally blown because he was going over flatland. He could look inside of houses and see people, what they were doing, even though they were inside their two-dimensional houses. He could look inside of people and see what they ate for lunch, because he was in a three-dimensional situation hovering over it. And then the two-dimensional entity asked the three-dimensional entity a question which I'll never forget reading the first time. He said, this is really fascinating. Now, show me the fourth dimension. Where is the fourth dimension? And the three-dimensional being said, well, there is no fourth dimension. Three dimensions is all there is. And this really exposes kind of the limitations of the way that we view things. Now, indeed, if there is a fourth dimension, if there's a fifth dimension, if there's a billionth dimension, and God exists in it, I don't know if that's the case, but if it were the case, God could exist outside of that dimension and interact with us both in time and space. Now, we don't look at time as going back and forward, but let's assume for the moment it does. He could still interact with us in these in this manner, simply by intersecting our universe, simply the same way that the three-dimensional being was able to interact with the two-dimensional being. So I don't see any limitation of an entity outside of time and space interacting with an entity inside of time and space. And I think that the flatland analogy is something which really illustrates that very clearly.
Right. Ruben asks, but then God loses his omniscience when he stepped into time? That's not true.
No, I think that we've answered that already because God at one time was omniscient. So he knew everything that was, it seems to me, he knew everything that was going to happen in the history. And then when he stepped into time, God knew everything that was going to happen in time. He maintained his omniscience, even though he was flowing in time. I don't see an inconsistency there.
Mm-hmm. So one viewer said, in the first stage of the argument, you had two people who were omniscient, and you proved that this led to a logical problem. However, would this not also be a problem if they weren't omniscient, but just knew each other quite well? And surely we can have two people who know each other well enough to predict what the other might say.
That's true. But I think omniscience implies and necessitates total knowledge. And what we showed with the omniscience is that total knowledge could not exist bilaterally. Certainly, there could be limited knowledge. I mean, if this omniscience only went one way, I mean, how do we know that there's a God? If the arrow comes down from God in terms of omniscience, how do we know God? It doesn't mean that we're omniscient over God, but certainly we can know God through Christ, and therefore be able to relate to him, to pray to him, to understand him. And just because we have a relationship with him doesn't mean that we are omniscient over God. Omniscient means total knowledge.
James asked if you're essentially just playing word games.
Yeah, you know, this is very interesting, and this is the reason that I did the preamble about indeed the word games. And indeed, on first viewing, all of this idea of self-refuting and stuff sounds like a word game. In fact, I put up the cartoons, which I think are hilarious, that show that the self-refuting is very funny. And you do get into word games, but I will tell you, if you get into the area of algorithmic information theory, which is based on this idea of self-refuting, built on Gödel's original idea, it becomes enormously powerful in terms of the deductions you can reach. And it is not a word game. It is reality. Strange loops do not exist in reality. And therefore, we have to play around with our logic and make sure that these strange loops does not exist. The non-existence of these strange loops does incredible things. We can show in mathematics now that there are things that exist. We can prove they exist, yet we can also prove that they're unknowable. Why are they unknowable? Because if we knew them, it would form a strange loop. This is in the mathematical literature, and I can refer anybody that's interested into it to this literature. So no, the strange loops are incredibly serious in terms of mathematics, logic, and the implications of what happens in reality. Okay, Jonathan, you're muted, I think.
I'm sorry. Vladimir says it was asking if it's possible to get a copy of your presentation slides.
Yes, certainly. I'd be happy to. I don't know if you have a universal way to get, if I could send them to you and you can make them accessible. Is that possible?
Folks, if you want a copy of Dr. Marks's presentation slides, then email me at I'll type it in the chat window, Jim McClatchy at apologetics-academy.org, and Dr. Marks will send me the presentation and I will forward it to anyone who requests it. Let's see. We have one other submitted question at the moment. Brian Marion was commenting that the Trinity is ontological unity and economic rule subordination from Wayne Grudem. But we've discussed the Trinity already. Okay, does anyone else have any questions that they would like to submit, or anyone else want to raise your hand and talk to our speaker this evening? Unfortunately, Winston Ewart is back. I don't know if Winston Ewart has any comments that he wants to share.
Yeah, I'd be interested too. How'd I do, Winston?
Yeah, he actually dropped out for a little bit, but he's returned. Winston Ewart says, I don't know technical issues prevent me from seeing what's a bit. Okay. Well, Winston, if you want to come up as a speaker and make a contribution on the topic, since you were a co-author with the paper, then feel free.
I will say that in this upcoming book that I have with Bill Dembski and Winston Ewart, these are two of the most brilliant men that I've ever met, that I've ever had the opportunity of working with. Their minds are just so incredibly creative, and boy, it's an honor to work with them.
Yeah, I would concur with that sentiment. Jason McCool says, thanks for the offer to share slides. We'll need some time to digest this.
Yes. Again, some of the details, I think I showed you the access to the paper. Some of the details are things you just have to sit down and kind of slog through. And they're, even when you get to just 3 entities, it becomes very, very complicated. But the idea you can take this conclusion about the feedback loops, and I finally found it, I found it very interesting that these feedback loops related to the strange loops, and the fact that indeed this was a relationship. I found that very, very fascinating.
Hmm. So Winston Ewart says, I'm not in a situation where I can do that. Mostly I just came back to hear Dr. Marks boast about me.
Yes, Winston is also a very modest young man.
Anyone else have any questions for Dr. Marks this evening? If Winston Ewart wants to submit any questions, since he's probably the most conversant with this material out of those here present. Had a fairly good number tonight. We peaked at about 33 people. Okay. Do I currently have any questions? If you want to either
yeah, I will mention for what it's worth, this idea of Gödel's incompleteness theorem, built on this idea of strange loops, led to Alan Turing's work, and Turing showed something very interesting. Let me give you the most profound consequence of not having strange loops. Turing showed that anything that you could have a recipe for, anything that you could have a program for, is algorithmic. You can write a computer program to do this operation. Now, the question is, are there things which are not algorithmic? Are there things which we see or experience that can't be explained in terms of a recipe or an algorithm? Turing indeed showed this. He showed something called the halting problem, was something you cannot write a computer program to analyze another computer program to say whether that computer program will halt. He showed you can't write a program to do that. So there indeed exist things which are non-algorithmic. Now this has some, this avoidance of strange loops has an incredible consequence in terms of artificial intelligence, because there is work primarily by, popularized by Roger Penrose. Penrose was a mathematician that wrote with Stephen Hawking in terms of the first work in the first black holes. And he has maintained that the human brain is non-algorithmic. So therefore, because of all of this strange loops and what it has developed to, there are arguments now made by very serious people that the brain cannot be a computer, that it is above and beyond a computer. Now, Penrose talks to or speaks to the idea of creativity. A computer and a computer program cannot be creative. If you write a computer program, for example, in artificial intelligence to learn to play chess, it will never go on and learn how to play Go or any other game. It'll just do what you are told. Yet this creative idea, which is above and beyond this algorithmic sort of thing, is something that we see and experience all the time. If you talk to mathematicians, they will go, oh my gosh, I didn't see where this idea came from. It just occurred to me in the middle of the night. We also had in the arts, you can talk to people who write songs and they will say, I don't know where this song came from. It's totally non-algorithmic. Classic, as Paul McCartney wrote yesterday. He swore that he didn't write it. He swore that he had heard it from somewhere else. Yet it turned out he did write it. Same thing with Hoagy Carmichael in the classical tune Stardust, that Carmichael heard his song and he says there was this queer sensation that he was experiencing something above and beyond, bigger than himself in terms of this creativity. And it goes into the mathematics. Friedrich Gauss said he had this incredible epiphany in the middle of the night that allowed him to solve the problem. And he says, I don't know where it came from. The U.S. Patent Office used to require something called a flash of genius associated with a patent before it would patent it. All of this creativity and the study of whether the human mind is a computer or not is based on the work of Turing, Gregory Chaitin, and some other people, and is based on the non-existence of strange loops.
Cool. Anonymous viewers posted in the Q&A. Yeah, Snow is going to have fun. Yeah, that's the Muslim.
What's that?
Yeah, Snow. He has a YouTube channel. He's always bashing the Trinity. So
okay.
He likes to pull things out of context and
make
YouTube videos to make people say things that they didn't necessarily intend to say. HP said two things. He's in the Q&A. He says, I'm new here, but thanks for having this platform. I'm just listening for now. You guys are way beyond my knowledge base. Well, HP, if you want to join us for future sessions, we are, you can find the upcoming schedule, apologetics-academy.org/online-training. And you can find the future schedule and the URL that you can click on to participate in our future sessions. We have a very high-profile lineup of speakers and guests, which is very exciting. We have speakers booked up now all the way until February, and so you're very welcome to do that. And also, if there's Christians here who are struggling with sincere intellectual doubts, you can also submit a form via my website, and we can set up a live interactive meeting on the web to discuss your doubts and confidence and discuss whether your doubts have rational merit or not. HP is also asking, what is strange loops?
Strange loops are self-contradictory loops. The one that we talked about was the Cretan, and who said everything I say is a lie. And that can't exist, because if everything he said is a lie, he just lied, which means he tells the truth. And if he doesn't tell the truth, or if he tells the truth, then he says he always lies. But if he lies, he's telling the truth. So it's this loop that kind of goes around and around in your head. And those things do not exist in reality. It was used, again, by Kurt Gödel to overthrow mathematics by his little theorem X that says this theorem can't be proved. It was a self-referential statement that actually showed that all structures are either incomplete or inconsistent. And that kind of toppled mathematics. It also shows, no matter, if we loosely interpret it, means that no matter what assumptions that you have in your ideology, there are going to be some questions which you can't answer, or you answer inconsistently. The implications of it, I think, are just astonishing.
An anonymous viewer asks, could you re-show your Bob and Alice slide so we can screenshot it? Folks, if you want to see the recording of this is being recorded, and I will be uploading it to YouTube. You can find the YouTube channel. It's called Apologetics Academy on YouTube. Let me find that for you, so I can link to it in the chat. So if you want to get caught up on some of our past sessions, most of them are recorded there. And we'll be continuing to add recordings on a weekly basis. There, I've just linked in the chat window to the official YouTube channel of the Apologetics Academy, where you can get caught up in past sessions. And we will be adding this webinar to that catalog probably today or tomorrow. So, Bob, can you maybe show your Bob and Al slide again? Because Anonymous Viewer wants to get a screenshot of that.
Okay, which one was that now?
The Bob and Alice slide.
Okay, let me see. What would I do if I was smart? I would, I guess I would go to my desktop and, okay, are you seeing my screen now?
Not yet.
Okay, let me share my screen. How about now?
Yeah, now we can see your screen.
Okay, and which shot did they want?
The Bob and Alice slide.
Oh, there's a bunch of Bob and Alice slides.
Anonymous Viewer, if you maybe want to be more specific about which slide you were after, that might be helpful.
Well, here is my first Bob and Alice slide, I believe.
He says the first one.
Okay. This again is addressed in the paper by Winston and I on evoinfo.org. So you can actually download it, and there's a much more detailed discussion of this aspect there.
And by the way, evoinfo.org is an absolutely brilliant website. I highly recommend that people check it out. Check out the work of Dr. Marks and Dr. Bill Dembski and Winston Ewart and others who've been involved in that work, looking at the evolution, the limitations of neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory from a bioinformatics perspective. Very, very fascinating work.
Thank you.
Anonymous Viewer wants the second one, the second slide.
This one?
I think so. HP is asking, okay, for the Christian, what relevance do these things have to us in practical application?
Well, actually, there's a number of things. One of which is that the cool thing about being a Christian is that being a follower of Christ, I don't believe is correlated to intellect. You're going to find people of enormous intellect that follow Christ, and you're going to follow Christ, and you're going to find people that do not follow Christ that also have incredible intellect. And the beautiful thing about Christianity is that you can either swim on the surface if you're not really into it, or you can dive deep, and that's exactly what we're doing. I think the entire idea of apologetics is if what we believe is true, then it's going to stand the scrutiny of close inspection. And that is indeed what we are doing. And it shows that indeed the biblical account of omniscience of a single being is certainly consistent with the logic, at least that we have developed. So I think that's really the reason, and that's the contribution. The idea that omniscience is not theologically vacuous, or there you can't poke holes in it. Looks to be very consistent.
John is asking, can we get out of strange loops by just allowing truth value gaps, neither T or F? I think he means neither true or false.
And we get out of strange loops. Well, in fact, that's exactly what we do. If we're confronted by a strange loop, we say, nope, it can't be. So therefore we have a gap. That's a reason in algorithmic information theory that you have propositions which can be proven to be unknowable. Why are they unknowable? Because we have to avoid the strange loops. So if you want to call that just an avoidance or a gap in knowledge, then you're welcome to do so.
Well, and just out of interest in my own question, do you think that God's exhaustive knowledge of all future all things future. So his exhaustive knowledge of time and space, and coupled with his omnipotence, would suggest a deterministic view of reality.
No.
Okay. Why?
Would you like me to elaborate?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, we get to this idea of materialism and free will and predestination, kind of the Laplacian view of things. Let me dig deep in my head here and show this. Well, let me show you one of the places that strange loops happens. Okay. Turing's halting problem says that we cannot look at a computer program and tell whether or not it will halt or not. There was a guy named Rice who generalized this. Now, this is kind of mind-blowing in a way that you cannot tell if a computer program will do anything. You can't write a program to tell if another computer program will do anything. You can't write a computer program to say whether the program you're analyzing will print out the number 3. You can't analyze it to show that it will halt or not. You can't write a computer program to analyze another program and predict anything that it will do. Now, this to me seems to be enormously mind-blowing, because what it says we have a computer program. Somebody comes and they give you a computer program. That computer program is totally deterministic. We're going to assume that there's no random numbers in it or anything, but it's deterministic. There it sits. It's deterministic. Yet, there's nothing we can say about what that program will do. That's non-algorithmic. Even though it sits there in deterministic materialism, we cannot tell what that computer program is going to do.
Okay.
I think it was John Polkinghorne said that many times you have seemingly conflicting sort of ideas. And John Polkinghorne, for those of you who aren't familiar, is a physicist who decided one day that he wanted to go back to school and become an Anglican priest. And I think he was in the physicist in the same department as Stephen Hawking. And today he really has a good handle on some of the ideas in the trade-off between science and faith. And he points to the ideas of some of these supposed conflicts that we have. One is like predestination versus free will, being things which seemingly are a conflict now, but which are actually resolved at higher levels. He goes back to the quantum to the definition of whether a light particle was a wave or a particle. And there were big arguments. And then, boom, we found out that at a higher level that indeed they were consistent. And I think that we find some of these curious things that's the reason I love algorithmic information theory. It is more fun than any of the science fiction I ever read as a kid. It is just the astonishing things that you can do. But the idea that you can have a materialistic, fixed computer program, and there it sits. You cannot have an algorithm. You cannot write another computer program to say what it does. So even though it's fixed, it's materialistic, you cannot predict what it will do. And this goes back to Laplace's idea of materialism. He thought if you knew every position and every velocity and every acceleration of every particle in the universe, you could totally predict what was happening. According to Rice's theorem, that's not right. It was still, even though everything was fixed and materialistic, the future was still unknowable.
Right. We actually had a hand raised from David in the audience. So David, you're now live with Dr. Marks. Do you want to make a comment or ask a question?
Yeah, so I was wondering how the halting problem involves strange loops.
Okay, that's actually a very good question. It is actually a proof by contradiction. Do you remember the proof that all integers were interesting? It was a whimsical proof, but nevertheless, it illustrated proof by contradiction. The halting problem is proven by the same methodology. You assume that a halting problem exists, a halting program exists, that there exists a program that can look at all these other programs and say whether or not they will halt. And then you walk down a logical, a staircase of logic, and you get to the bottom and you find out that there's a contradiction. So indeed, the proof by contradiction is a type of strange loop, if you will. And indeed, that's the way that the halting problem is proven. By the way, if you purchase the book Introduction to Evolutionary Informatics, there is a detailed description in there of the halting problem, if you're interested in digging into the details.
Great.
Is that all from you, David?
I think so.
Okay, great. Okay. So here's a question for you, Dr. Marks. What do you think of Molinism? Are you familiar with the concept of Molinism?
No.
Oh, okay. So Molinism is the idea that God possesses middle knowledge. So I'm not a Molinist, but I'm representing their position. A Molinist basically believes that so he has his free knowledge, his natural knowledge, and his middle knowledge. His natural knowledge is his knowledge of all possible counterfactuals, all possible ways that things could have occurred, all possible worlds, if you will. His free knowledge is his knowledge of the world that he freely chose to actualize, and his middle knowledge is his knowledge of how free agents will behave in different sets of circumstances. And so he knows perfectly how a free agent will behave given different sets of counterfactuals. And so a Molinist, such as William Lane Craig, for example, or Bruce Gordon, will argue that God creates it's basically an attempt to provide a theodicy, that God creates a world suffused with the optimum amount of evil and suffering and so forth, in order that the maximal number of people will come to freely choose him without violating their own autonomy or free will and so forth. What do you think of that view?
Oh, well, I tell you, there's a great ontological proof of God, Aslam's ontological proof, which I don't know if I totally understand, nor do I know if I agree with it. But I love his preamble, and the preamble is God is greater than anything that we can possibly imagine. And I believe indeed that's the case, that he's greater than anything we can imagine. And I think because of this viewpoint, Christians have been able in Eastern Europe to develop mathematics and technology and bring us into the Renaissance and other things. So no, I do not believe that God is limited in any way. And again, he's greater than anything we could imagine. And it seems this idea of limiting the knowledge that you just talked about is contrary to that idea.
Okay. My critique of Molinism is that it basically sets God up as a kind of supercomputer who's just crunching the numbers like a super chess computer. It's just crunching through variations and so on.
Okay.
It takes away sort of the personal nature of the atonement, whereas it's all about getting the maximal number of people. So that would be one of my critiques. HP says that the logic is faulty if they claim God created a world with evil. Evil is a result of man, not tied to God. So I mean, there's different perspectives on the origins of evil. Personally, I mean, I think that man is responsible for the evil which he commits. However, God sometimes not only uses evil, but he actually wills, in a certain sense, that evil should occur. Let me nuance that so it's clear what we're talking about. So I'll give an example from the book of Isaiah and chapter 10, where you have God using the nation of Assyria as the instrument of his anger, the rod of his wrath. It says in Isaiah chapter 10, verse 5, "At Assyria, the rod of my anger, the staff in their hands is my fury. Against the godless nation I send him, and against the people of my wrath I command him, to take spoil and seize plunder, and to tread them down like the mire of the streets. But he does not so intend, and his heart does not so think. But it is in his heart to destroy and to cut off nations, not a few. For he says, are not my commanders all kings?" And so on. And then it says down in verse 12, when the Lord has finished all his work on Mount Zion and on Jerusalem. So he's used the nation of Assyria as the instrument of his wrath upon Jerusalem, upon Israel. And it says, he will punish the speech of the arrogant heart of the king of Assyria, and the boastful look in his eyes, for he says, by the strength of my hand I have done it, and by my wisdom for I have understanding. I remove the boundaries of peoples and plunder their treasures. Like a bull I bring down those who sit on thrones. My hand has found like a nest the wealth of the peoples, and as one gathers eggs that have been forsaken, so I have gathered all the earth, and there was none that moved a wing or opened the mouth or chirped. And it says in verse 15, shall the axe boast over him who hews with it, or the saw magnify itself against him who wields it, as if a rod should wield him who lifts it, or as if a staff should lift him who is not wood. Therefore the Lord God of hosts will send wasting sickness among his stout warriors, and under his glory a burning will be kindled, like a burning of fire. The light of Israel will become a fire, and his Holy One a flame, and it will burn and devour his thorns and briars in one day. So the idea is, so God has used the nation of Assyria as the instrument of his wrath, the rod of his anger against the nation of Israel. And it literally says, Assyria is like an axe in the hands of God. But the king of Assyria doesn't so think. He thinks that he's doing it all by his own strength. And so he's actually committing these evil atrocities, which God isn't just using, but he's actually foreordained that this should happen. So I'd make a distinction between God's decretive will and his prescriptive will. His prescriptive will is his laws and commandments. And so the king of Assyria violated the prescriptive will of God, but he was in perfect accord with the decretive will of God. So although it is in one sense true that God does not will evil, he nonetheless will evil in a different sense. So he wills evil not in a prescriptive sense, but in a decretive sense. Like, I don't think that the fall of man, when Adam and Eve sinned in the Garden of Eden, took God by surprise. Rather, God doesn't throw the cosmic die, look down the corridors of time and say, oh, that's the way it turned out, I better make the best use of this. But rather, God, he is completely sovereign over time and space. Romans 8:28, God worked all things together for the good of those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. In Genesis 50, Joseph says to his brothers in Egypt, you meant this for evil, but God meant it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So there is a sense in which God can will evil to occur in a decretive sense, even if not in a prescriptive sense. I don't know if you would agree with me on that, Dr. Marks.
Good and evil is really a rough thing to talk about. I will bring it back to the topic that we talked about in our presentation, and the idea of the strange loops. I don't think an atheist has the ability to ask. Well, they have the ability, but they're not. They shouldn't be allowed to ask, what is the source of evil? And this again is a kind of a meta statement. I think is very popular. I first read it, and I think in C.S. Lewis, is they cannot ask us where evil came from, because they do not have the basis to define evil. I think a Christian can ask another Christian. We can have a dialogue among Christians of the source of evil, but an atheist does not have the right to ask that, because it's mixed in with the assumption that there is an evil, and then you have to go to where that evil came from. So that in itself is an example of kind of a meta statement where you apply it to yourself, which goes back to the beginning of the talk. And
Dr. Frank Turek, by the way, in December is going to be talking to us about stealing from God, how atheists need God to make their case, which is based on one of his recent books.
I will mention too, in Frank Turek's book on I Don't Have the Faith to Be an Atheist, he uses the idea of the self-contradiction quite a bit. He calls it the roadrunner approach, where if you're debating with an atheist, you apply their statements to themselves, this meta sort of relationship. And his metaphor is that it's like the coyote chasing after the roadrunner. The coyote is the atheist, and he's chasing after the roadrunner, and you apply the statement to himself, and bloop, he just ran over a cliff. He's standing high above the cliff and looks around, realizes he's been duped, and then he falls down. So it's the roadrunner policy, if you're familiar with Turek's work, and I don't have enough faith to be an atheist.
HP says atheists don't have a proper platform to establish evil, as is all random. I think there's actually a couple of reasons why an atheist really doesn't have a foundation for evil. One thing is that it presupposes good, and as C.S. Lewis said, in mere Christianity. One doesn't call a line crooked unless someone has some idea of a straight line to compare it to. So
Exactly.
to say that there's evil in the world presupposes that there's good, which in turn presupposes a transcendent moral law. And I think that God is the standard by which all things are measured. So that's a solution, incidentally, to the Euthyphro dilemma from Plato's dialogues. That the question is, well, Plato in his dialogues talks about a man who's taking his father to court over his involvement in the death of a slave, and he's asked by Socrates, well, how do you know that you're doing the right thing? And he says, well, the gods would approve. And then the question is asked is, well, is it good because the gods say so, or do the gods say so because it's good? And so you have this Euthyphro dilemma. And the solution to that, of course, is that God is the standard by which everything else is measured. It's not that God is complying with some standard that's above and beyond him. And it's not that God is arbitrary and that he just by fiat declares something to be good or bad, but rather he is the standard by which everything is measured. But the atheist really doesn't have a foundation to say that something is objectively evil. If there's something objectively evil, even anything, if it is objectively evil to torture babies for pleasure, then then God exists because there is some transcendent moral standard. And moreover, from an atheistic paradigm, if you suppose that we are simply reducible to to matter and motion, to rearrange pawn scum dance with the music of our DNA, if our conscious brain is simply reducible to the material, if our conscious mind is simply reducible to the material constituents of the brain, then how can you call something evil which is deterministic? If a rock falls from a cliff and hits you on the head, you don't say that the rock was evil because it's just a material entity. It's not morally culpable. It doesn't have agency. Whereas if someone punches you in the nose, you would say that they behaved immorally because they are morally culpable. They are agents. They possess existential freedom of the will. But I think that atheism really is corrosive to any form of moral objectivism.
I'm learning a lot here. I'm just a nerd without the foundation and the philosophy and some of the theological background that you're giving. So thank you.
Okay.
I'm learning a lot.
I'm glad. HP says, in Genesis, he said all was good. These examples you gave are a result of the fall, the pattern of Genesis prior to the fall. Yeah, I would argue that the fall didn't take God by surprise. So it's not like he threw the cosmic die, looked down the corridors of time and said, oh, the fall happened, I should make the best use of this. But rather he actually, I think, intended the fall in a decretive sense in order to bring about the greater good, which is the glorification of his son, Jesus Christ, in order to bring us into a more intimate relationship with Christ than we could otherwise enjoy. Because if there had been no fall, then we couldn't have enjoyed the intimacy of communion with Christ that we can as a consequence of that. So God chooses to bring good out of evil. So God willed the fall in a decretive sense, even if not in a prescriptive sense. That would be my view. Okay, so HP says, I ask atheists when they make moral claims, which rock did you find out this information was written on and who wrote it?
Yep.
And HP says, yes, I agree. I'm glad that we are in agreement on that particular point. And David said in the chat box, can the atheists say Christianity looks self-contradictory? It says God likes these things and not other things. He can control everything, and things that he doesn't like are happening while things he likes are not happening. I'm just trying to understand the question here.
Yeah.
Okay, so things God likes in terms of evil in the world, and God doesn't like evil in the world, and yet evil happens. And so is this a contradiction? I think maybe that's what he's getting at. I would say that God chooses to bring the greater good out of evil. And so it's not that I would maintain, as a good Calvinist, of course, that there's no such thing as purposeless evil or purposeless suffering. all evil and suffering has an ultimate purpose, and God alone holds the box top of the jigsaw, and he knows how all the pieces are meant to fit together. As Romans 8:28 says, God works all things together for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. David's saying it's a way to avoid the roadrunner problem. I'm not sure I quite follow.
Oh, what did he ask?
He says it's a way to avoid the roadrunner problem.
Oh.
I'm not quite sure what he's getting at there, but Brian Marion is asking, Brian Marion in South Africa is asking, has not God purposely created us to be free moral agents? I guess that's a question to me in light of what I just said, but yes, he did create us to be free moral agents, but there's freedom in different senses, so we have to be careful in qualifying what we mean by freedom. So I would maintain that we do have free will, but I would maintain that we have creaturely free will. So we have free will that is in bondage to a sinful nature. We have free will within constraints. I mean, left to our own devices, we can only choose evil, and we cannot choose God in and of our own will, because our will is in bondage to a sinful heart, a sinful nature. And if you read the book of Romans, in chapter 8, we read in verse 5 and following, for those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on the things of the Spirit. For to set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace. For the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God, for it does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot. Those who are in the flesh cannot please God. And so this raises the question then, hey, wait a minute, is faith and repentance not something which is pleasing to God? And the answer, of course, is yes, it is something which is pleasing to God. Well, we're told in Romans 8 that if you are in bondage to the flesh, if you are in the realm of the flesh, you cannot submit to God's law, and you cannot be pleasing to God. And so that suggests that in order to actually repent and have faith in Christ, which is something which is pleasing to God, then we need to have our hearts supernaturally regenerated by the Holy Spirit. Ezekiel 36, for example, God says, I will remove from your heart stone and give you a heart of flesh. I will sprinkle clean water on you and make you clean and move you to obey my laws and decrees. 2 Corinthians 5:17, if anyone be in Christ, he's a new creature. The old has gone, the new has come. So there's certainly, in John 6:44, Jesus says, no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up at the last day. So it seems to me that we are we possess creature free will, but our free will is in bondage to our sinful nature. It is only by the power of the Spirit that we can be supernaturally regenerated and recreated to grow in conformity to Christ, and to change the will from cherishing the things of the world, the things of the flesh, the sinful nature, to lay that aside and cherish the things of God, those things which are spiritual. So I trust that answers your question, Brian. But if you disagree with that, then you can ask another question, or you can come up and be a co-panelist. I'm happy to converse with you on that, or if Dr. Marks has any additional comments on that.
Nope.
Okay.
Well said.
Well, thank you. Okay, we don't have any current questions that are submitted. Anyone have any further questions that they would like to submit, or anyone want to raise their hand to interact with Dr. Marks on anything that's been said? Anonymous viewer says, could the Alice Bob problem be resolved by a third answer, perhaps like maybe from an omniscient being?
I'm not sure I understand what he means.
I'm not quite sure either, but I think what he's getting at is that just as in the Trinity, we have one divine essence that is shared fully and completely and participated in fully and completely by not one but three divine persons who are co-equal and co-eternal. And just as the divine essence cannot be sliced up like a pizza, I think he's arguing, okay, so Alice and Bob are persons, but if they together participate in the essence of one being, then maybe that's a third resolution to the problem. I think that's what he's getting at. Are you following me?
No.
Okay. So remember we were discussing earlier the concept of the Trinity?
Yes.
And the fact that I know what you were saying. I meant that instead of an answer like yes or no, we could have maybe. Okay. Earlier we were discussing the Trinity, and we were saying, if we replace Alice and Bob with Father and Son, well, does this not apply equally to the Trinity as a refutation of the doctrine of the Trinity? And the solution that I proposed was that, well, the divine essence is not something which is sliced up like a pizza. Each of the divine persons participates fully and completely in that divine essence. It's not that Father, Son, and Spirit each participates in a third of the divine essence, but each possesses the fullness of the divine essence, qualities, attributes, essence, prerogatives, and so forth. And so you have one divine being which is omniscient, even though there are three individual persons who participate in that essence. So that's my interpretation of this question. But my answer to that would be yes. I think that's the only response from a Christian perspective. I don't know if you would disagree or have anything else to say on that.
Well, in terms of in the Trinity, just thinking about it as I sit here, I can imagine one of those graphs that we did having three nodes at the top, three omniscient nodes, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, with an equality sign between them, because they are indeed one. And then I can imagine on that graph, because I think in terms of graphs, because I'm a nerd, I can think of each one of those having omniscient arrows coming down to all of creation, and there being no inconsistency or strange loops occurring. So certainly that's something that could be a model that explains all of these, the involvement of the Trinity in this idea.
Okay. HP says, since I'm new here, what is the background of the doc, basically field of study? Do you want to answer that?
The background of what?
Of the doc, who means you, the doctor.
Oh, the doc. I'm the doc. Okay, cool. Well, it's kind of interesting. My background, I got involved. I don't know how far you want to go back, but I got involved in artificial neural networks and artificial intelligence many years ago, and that just fascinated me. One of the things I was really interested in is evolutionary computing, and engineers use evolutionary computing. I was the president of an IEEE society. I don't know if IEEE is the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers. It's the largest professional society in the world, because it has over 750,000 members worldwide. It's enormous. And so we started a journal called IEEE Transactions on Evolutionary Computing. And engineers are very different than scientists. We don't look at evolution from a science point of view. Science has a very different perspective in the way that they deal with things. Science kind of takes models and they craft them, they put them up on a throne, and they kind of worship it like a queen. And we see that with evolution and some of these other things that are going on right now. But the engineer, on the other hand, takes the queen down from the throne, makes her scrub the floor, and if she doesn't work, we end up firing her. So in terms of evolution, that's the reason that intelligent design and some of the critiques of evolution are really accepted widely in the area of engineering, because they look at it and they say, my goodness, it doesn't work. Nevertheless, there are techniques where you can use models of evolutionary computing to do interesting things. I became very interested in that, and I began to do evolutionary computing, recognizing the beginning of its limitations. I was in my office one time writing a program, evolutionary computing, and a colleague came in and he said, what are you doing? I said, I'm writing an evolutionary computer program. And he said, oh, cool, when can I talk to it? The idea, of course, is absurd, because that computer program was just going to do what I told it to do and design what I told it to design, and then it would quit doing things. Nevertheless, engineers have embraced this. We founded this journal, IEEE Transactions on Evolutionary Computing. And, there's a lot of engineers still using evolutionary computing to design stuff, and it does work. NASA used evolutionary computing, for example, to design an antenna. And it's a really, really strange looking antenna, but nevertheless it worked, and it's up in space now doing great and wonderful things. But there are limitations. And so with this background of artificial intelligence and neural networks and evolutionary computing, when I came to Baylor, I met Bill Dembski. Bill Dembski was right at the end of his stay at Baylor University. And we met at an apologetics group, which was put on by Walter Bradley, and we began to talk. I'd read some of his stuff, really wasn't intimately familiar with it, but we resonated. It was incredible. He says information is put into search. And I said, well, yeah, of course it is. And he says, yeah, but the people in evolution on the biology side don't believe that's the case. So we came up and we actually published one of the first papers, peer-reviewed mainstream literature papers in the engineering literature, showing that indeed evolutionary programming required the infusion of information. And without this information, it didn't work. Evolution didn't work. And then we were off to the races. I think between Winston and Bill and I, we published maybe, 20 different archival peer-reviewed publications relating to intelligent design. Winston Ewart, by the way, was the first PhD to actually get a PhD in an area specifically aimed at intelligent design. All of his dissertation, his PhD dissertation, was intelligent design. So that indeed is how we got started. Then I got into a problem. Tell me if this is more than you want to know. I got into a problem because we had a president, John Lilly, who didn't like intelligent design, so my website was removed. And this was a line which we couldn't cross, so I had to go out and hire a lawyer. And we actually met with the people of Baylor. And I have a visitor. Come on in, Eric. So we met with Baylor, and it went on and on. And I was in the movie Expelled. So if you want to go and watch me in a movie, Expelled. And one of the greatest things that came out of this is kind of whimsical, but I am so proud that I have the lowest Erdos-Bacon number of most any professional. Mine is lower than Stephen Hawking's. It's lower than Carl Sagan. And I have an Erdos-Bacon number of 5. You're probably asking, what's an Erdos-Bacon number? Well, I'm going to have this on my gravestone, by the way. Your Bacon number is how many movies you are displaced from Kevin Bacon. And because I was in the movie Expelled, Ben Stein was in the movie Expelled. He was in the movie Trains, Planes, and Automobiles with Kevin Bacon. So I have a Bacon number of 2. Paul Erdos was this prolific mathematician that went around, took methamphetamines, and stayed with people and said, "I'll stay at your house and I can work on these things work on mathematics for a month with you as long as you feed me." And the mathematicians have your Erdos number is how many papers you are removed from Paul Erdos. So I have an Erdos number of 3 because I published with somebody who published with somebody that published with Paul Erdos. And so your Bacon Erdos number, which is on Wikipedia, take a look. Your Bacon Erdos number is the summation of the 2. So I have a Bacon Erdos number of 5. Stephen Hawking's is up there, I think it's 6, and so I'm very proud of that. But anyway, I deviate a little bit from the story. After John Lilly, who removed my website, was fired by the Baylor Board of Regents. He wasn't let go. He was literally fired. They offered him the option to resign, and he said, "No, I'm not going to resign." So they actually fired him for what he did, I think, to me, and plus a bunch of other stuff. And so currently, my relationship with Baylor is very open. They know exactly what I do with the intelligent design work. They're very tolerant of it. I simply have to say in certain cases that it doesn't represent the views of Baylor University, because we have a lot of theistic evolutionists here. And things are going very, very well. Currently, we still continue in our work in intelligent design, carrying on some of the things that Winston actually started. We have a great new PhD student here, Eric Holloway. Eric, say hi. This is Eric Holloway. Hello? No, come and put your face right there so we can see it. Okay, that's Eric. That's Eric.
Hey, yeah.
Oh, you know Eric, huh?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah. So what we've been able to do, a lot of it because of Expelled, is we've actually been able to attract a lot of really, really great students, including Winston, Jonathan here, David Namadi, Iwan, who was brought. Iwan, I can't say his last name. He's from Indonesia. I still can't say his last name, but he was brought. What is that? Sanjaja? Yeah. Okay, Sanjaja. Okay, I knew that. But we still have an ongoing work here in intelligent design, primarily now applying the tools of information theory, defining what we mean by information theory. It turns out that physics has done a great deal of defining mass and energy and time and all of this other stuff, but there's really been no look at what information is. We know information when we see it, but really people haven't studied it. And I think our group has a handle on that and has made some significant contributions to the exact modeling of information in terms of information theory. And so that's where our focus is now. I went last week to a seminar sponsored by John Sanford, who some of you might know. He's a professor at Cornell University, and he's very into biology. So we're trying to also learn about biology. Some of these new incredible things that are happening with epigenetics. And we were there from people, good Christian men and women, like from the National Institutes of Health and such, that are looking into this new field. And we would like to apply some of our information theory to some of this biological work so that we can actually get a handle on the information content of some of the things which are happening in epigenetics. So that's what we're doing now. And I'm sure that's more than what you wanted to know, so I'll be quiet now.
Okay. Winston Ewart in the chat box said, I spent a while thinking about the maybe response when we wrote the paper. On the intuitive level, if you are omniscient, you shouldn't be forced to give maybe answers, and the underlying math expanding the possibilities to 3 answers don't resolve the strange loops from reasoning too complex for me to type out here. Okay.
Well, I would counter that, yeah, the omniscient being doesn't have to give you an answer, but I don't think that's a question, if I understand the comment right. The question is, can they give you the answer?
Right. Aaron says, is this a strange loop? A man cannot choose God first, but God chooses him, John 6:44. So then do we ever, or are we able to choose a relationship with God?
Wow, that's kind of Calvinist stuff, right? And I tell you, this is above my pay grade. I don't know. I don't know if I see the strange loop there.
Yeah, I mean, there is always a tension when we were talking about the interface between divine sovereignty and human responsibility, and it is a very difficult tension. But every worldview has some sort of free will tension or free will paradox, free will enigma. Whether you're a materialist, whether you're a Christian, whether you're a Muslim, whether you're a Calvinist or an Armenian, whatever view you take, there is some kind of free will paradox that you have to try and get your head around and resolve. And frankly, I don't think that we will ever fully understand.
I don't either. But I also think it will be resolved on a higher level. My father, who got his GED, never went to college or anything, he explained me predestination versus free will in a very, very nice story. He asked me, in response to my question to him, he says, when you dig a ditch and you go out and you take your shovel and you dig a ditch, are you creating that ditch out of your free will, or was the ditch already there and you're taking the hole out of it, or you're taking the dirt out of it? So that was his explanation of free will versus predestination. And I think that, in many instances, it's kind of At least when posed like that, it's a foolish question.
Yeah. And in answer also to Aaron's question, I would also say, as I said earlier, that in bondage to our flesh, in bondage to our human nature, in bondage to sin, no, we cannot ever choose a relationship with God. In fact, the book of Romans, in chapter 3, says that no one seeks after God, right? So there's no way that we can actually choose God in the realm of the flesh. Jeremiah 17:9, the heart of man is deceitful of all things and desperately wicked. It's a doctrine of total depravity. The first of the doctrines of Tulip, the 5 doctrines of grace. Total depravity maintains that in our sin, we're in bondage. We cannot choose God, as Romans 3 says in verse 11 and 12, or 10, 11, 12. None is righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seeks for God. All have turned aside together, they become worthless. No one does good, not even one. So I would maintain that, I would maintain that we cannot choose God in and of our own volition unless we are actually transformed by the power of the Holy Spirit. In 1 John 5, we read, everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ has been born of God. And everyone who loves the Father loves whoever has been born of him. So in other words, if you believe that Jesus is the Christ, you have been born of God. So the spiritual rebirth actually precedes faith in Christ. And I would say that it precedes the faith in repentance. So
how do I mute myself? I got a sneeze thing.
Sorry, there's the bottom left, yeah. HP says we have to be free moral agents or love is not rational. Yes, I think that's correct. But then I think that we have to be careful how we nuance what we mean by free moral agents. I mean, if you are an Arminian and you think that that free will trumps divine sovereignty, then I would argue that there is no, the only logical path to go down is the path of open theism, which is to say that God doesn't have exhaustive knowledge of the future, that the future is open. And an open theist tries to argue that just as there are certain things which God cannot logically do, like he can't contradict himself, he can't make a rock so big he can't lift it, he can't make a square circle, so there are certain things that God can't even in principle know, such as how free agents will behave. So that would be an open theistic position, which I would argue is the consistent position for an Arminian to adopt. I think it's heretical, but there are people who adopt that position. HP says, Francis Schaeffer explains why the Trinity gives value to love. Yes, I would agree that the Trinity gives value to love, as we talked about earlier. HP also says, very interesting, I personally hate math, but I love presuppositional apologetics, and I'm fascinated to understand what people think, what they do. Well, that's great to know. HP also says, Nathan says more of a lack of information that this problem falls under, just as the issue with light being particle or wave, both are true. It's an interesting analogy. Brian Marion also asks, is the sinful nature rational? It depends what you mean by rational, Brian. I mean, there's a sense in which, I mean, I think Psalm 14 verse 1 and Psalm 53 verse 1 says that the fool said in his heart there is no God. Romans 1, 18 through 20 says that, or actually Romans 1 verses 18 through 25, that whole section says that basically man suppresses the truth and unrighteousness. And, in verse 20 it says that God's eternal qualities, or his eternal power and divine nature being clearly seen, being understood through what has been made so that men are without excuse. And so there's a sense in which, through creation, God's existence is plain to men, although they try to suppress that truth in unrighteousness. Luke 16, Abraham says to the rich man in hell that if he's been asked by the rich man to send Lazarus to his brothers to warn them not to come to this place, and he's told that they have Moses and the prophets, let them listen to them. And the rich man says, "No, Father Abraham, for if someone rises from the dead, then they'll believe." And he's told by Abraham that if they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not believe, even if someone rises from the dead. So there's a sense in which the evidence is so overwhelming from Moses and the prophets, from creation, and so forth, that we are irrational in rejecting Christianity, but in our sinful nature, our minds are just dull to that reality, and we don't perceive that. So no, the sinful nature in that sense is not rational. Brian also asking, God knows through his foreknowledge, and is he not in eternity and accordingly can see all of time? Yes, he is. I don't know, Dr. Marks, whether you would adopt an A theory or a B theory of time. You want to maybe talk about that?
What's an A theory and a B theory?
Okay. Sorry, this is a sort of a theory of time in philosophy. So a B theory of time is a tenseless theory of time, where basically past, present, and future are kind of illusory. They don't really exist as we understand them. Past, present, and future occur together. We exist in one point in this particular block, and God might stand outside of time and see it, but time, space, and past, present, and future are all existing together, and we're just at one point in the continuum. Whereas an A theory of time, past, present, and future really exist as we understand them, and we are, and so there's different philosophers. Some thought philosophers adopt an A theory, other philosophers adopt a B theory of time. William Lane Craig, for example, adopts an A theory of time. Some atheists might adopt a B theory of time as an attempt to try and argue that our universe is a brute fact and exists out of necessity, just as we would say that God is a brute fact and exists necessarily. And they would say, okay, so the main argument for our universe being contingent is that it began to exist. But if we adopt a B theory of time, or past, present, future are illusory, well, maybe our time-space continuum or our universe is in fact exists necessarily. But I would argue that if our universe is governed by physical laws, which have constants and values, then it's an enormously complex entity to say is a brute fact, whereas God is fundamentally simple because he's not composed of mathematical values and constants and laws. God is a disembodied mind, and so it's fundamentally simple, and so is a preferable explanation than to say that our universe exists as a brute fact out of self-necessity on a B theory of time. So that would be my view on that.
Well, I don't know, from the physics point of view. Well, let me backtrack. I like William Lane Craig's book on, I think, time and eternity. He has the best explanation, and it gets back to that digging the ditch and predestination versus free will. I can only comprehend the very simple explanations, but he says the reason that time exists is so that everything doesn't all happen at once. I thought that was a very good definition. Time allows things to be spread out. But, fascinatingly, in the area of string theory and some of these other places, there's actually talk about universes which have 2 dimensions of time or 3 dimensions of time going on. Now, that's totally beyond our comprehension, and I don't know how that falls within the philosophy that you just represented, but the idea that there could actually be more than one string of time happening within a single universe is just mind-boggling to me. I don't understand what it means. And I also know that physicists talk about imaginary time. In Stephen Hawking's book, he talked about so-called imaginary time as an explanation of why it wasn't necessary for a Big Bang to occur. He says if you have imaginary time, the universe could just kind of go, and it was there. I didn't understand it totally. I tell you, I am so entrenched in my experience in time that I have a very difficult time talking or thinking about any deep meaning in time. But the physicists are just going crazy with their different ideas of imaginary time and real time and multiple threads of time, and it's just crazy. But I think from the physics point of view, everything is speculative. I don't think they have their fingers around anything of value.
Right. Okay, any final questions before we wrap up? Because there's none currently submitted. Anyone want to raise their hand or submit a question? This is your final opportunity to do so. We have questions submitted. Let's see. Ruben says, well, if we're going to deal with off-topic questions anyway, such as about our sinful nature, well, it's off-topic to a certain extent, but it's also related to the topic. We're talking about our sinful nature because we're talking about omniscience, which actually is quite significantly related to the concept of free will and so on. But anyway, he says, well, if we're going to deal with off-topic questions then, such as about our sinful nature, I might well ask this one. How can any version of the doctrine of original sin be just? It's not our fault that we are born with a sinful nature. That, to tell you the truth, is probably the most difficult objection that I've encountered to Christianity. It comes up quite a lot, and is very difficult to articulate a persuasive response to it. I can have a bash at it. Do you want to have a go at it, Dr. Marks, or shall I?
Oh, no, I this is outside my pay grade also.
Okay. I would maintain, I think, and I'm happy to be corrected if someone wants to try and offer a better solution to this, because I find it a very difficult question. But I would maintain that we are judged for the sins that we have committed, but we cannot help but commit sin because we have a sinful nature, which is inherited from our ancestor Adam.
Yeah. I would agree to that. I mean, as an aborted baby, damned? No, I don't think they've ever done anything to warrant anything. What is the philosophy of an aborted baby? Are they damned with original sin, or
it's not something that we are given? I mean, I think that the psalmist David said, "In sin did my mother conceive me," and so there's a sense in which we all have a sinful nature from birth, and so we are from birth predisposed towards the flesh and sin. As for a newborn baby, I would maintain that there is an age of accountability. I think that we're not given a huge amount of information on that in Scripture. There's one suggestive passage in 2 Samuel 12 where David, having been confronted by Nathan the prophet, and the judgment that's pronounced on him by God is the baby that's been born to him by Bathsheba, with whom he committed adultery, is to die. And he says, the baby can't come back to be with me, but I can go to be with the baby. And so that suggests that the baby actually ends up in paradise.
Okay. Yeah, it seems, my understanding, again, and I'm not a deep theologian in any sense, but I think our sinful nature, we're not born with a black mark, but rather it's something that we earn for ourselves, and our propensity to do evil is written in our heart. I think for that is what we're accountable.
Right.
Yeah.
Brian Marion in South Africa, who debates Muslims, wanted to ask me a question about, I don't know if you, Robert, also want to respond to this, in Mark 4:31, where Jesus says, or verse 13:31 of Mark chapter 4, he says, "With what can we compare the kingdom of God, or what parable shall we use for it? It is like a grain of mustard seed, which when sown on the ground is the smallest of all the seeds on earth. Yet when it is sown, it grows up and becomes larger than all the garden plants and puts out large branches, so the birds of the air can make nests in its shade." And so the objection is, well, obviously Jesus doesn't know everything, because obviously the mustard seed is not the the smallest of seeds on earth. And so Jesus obviously made a mistake here as the Muslim argument against the omniscience of Christ. I have a response to that. Do you want to have a stab at it, or shall I respond?
Yeah, go for it.
I mean, the way I've always responded to that is to point out that Jesus is not here providing a botany lecture. This is it was the smallest of the seeds used by people in first century Judea, and so he's not providing them with a botany lesson. He's using what was understood to them to be the smallest of the seeds that they used there. So I've never considered that to be a very strong argument at all, really. I don't know if you're satisfied with that response, Brian, but if not, you can ask a follow-up if you want. HB says, I just want to say thanks for the time here. I enjoyed you, Nathan. I think he means Jonathan, and the doc. I look forward to hearing more.
By the way, if anybody does go to Evo Info, there are a lot of high-level videos there, YouTube videos, which explains more of our work, and indeed some of the things which we have made contributions to.
HP says, we are bent to sin, but it has to be a choice, I think. Yes, it is a choice, but it is a choice to which we are predisposed by our sinful nature. Ruben asks, sorry, what passage was that? I assume you mean about the smallest of mustard seeds, or the mustard seed being the smallest of seeds. That's in Mark chapter 4, verse 30 and 31 and 32. Or about the baby, he says. Sorry, that was 2 Samuel 12. Okay, do we have any final questions? We're down to only 17 people. Any final questions before we wrap up for the evening? Or for the afternoon, depending where you are in the world. Brian Marion says, I used that exact answer, but the Muslims were not satisfied. I presume his sinful irrationality manifested. And then Ruben says, here's the catch-22. If you're saying it is somehow inevitable that we sin, then you're undercutting our responsibility. If you say we actually have a real chance not to sin, then it's a mystery why out of 7 billion people, everyone fails. No, I think Scripture upholds both our responsibility and divine sovereignty in regards to our sin. How the two interface with one another, I think, is a mystery that will only resolve in eternity, if ever. I don't think that that's something that we can really understand, at least in this life. And I think that I don't think it's a potent objection to Christianity either that we can't understand this, because we're talking about the nature of time and the nature of divine omniscience and omnipotence, and that's not something which is really graspable or fully accessible to finite minds such as ourselves. And in any case, any other worldview is going to present you with a similar or different free will paradox. So let's pick your paradox. Someone says, thank you for a very interesting presentation, Dr. Marks.
You're very welcome.
Well, I don't think we have any further questions. Let me give one more opportunity for people to ask questions. Going once, going twice. Okay, I think that we can probably begin to wrap up. Brian Marion also says, thanks, Doc, for a great presentation.
Thank you.
In a real honor and joy to have you on, Dr. Marks, or share your wisdom and insights with us, and we'll be going on YouTube as well. So,
well, it was great to meet with your group. What a great structure you have. This is wonderful.
Yeah, you're well welcome to join us any week as a participant as well.
I will be. Yeah.
Great. Or if you'd like to be rescheduled for a future presentation, we can also arrange that. Just let me know.
Okay, I will.